Hi, everyone. This is Kerry Cassidy from Project Camelot, and tonight we have a very interesting guest, Gerald Clark, and he is the author of The Anunnaki from Nibiru, or of Nibiru, and he's also written some other books, and I'm going to give him a short introduction, and then we'll be introducing, get him on the screen and so on. So bear with me here, and I'll just read a short introduction. So Gerald Clark is the author of The Anunnaki of Nibiru. He's compiled an excellent overview of the evidence and cross-correlated much of the symbolism and ancient texts to support a more wide-ranging view of the role of the Anunnaki in our history. And from his site and regarding his book, he writes, many historical and scriptural findings not included in the canonical Bible have now come to light. Access to texts such as the Lost Book of Enoch, the Nag Hammadi Gospels, and the Book of Jubilees, among others, is now widely available, and when synthesized and correlated with existing documents like the Bible and the Quran, merits rethinking Western civilization's origins and intent. Prepare yourself for a profound belief-changing journey through ancient Persia, Sumer, Greece, Atlantis, and Rome to the United States, headquarters of the New Atlantis. This book is not like any other in the field. Expect the winged warrior aerial perspective of an army attack helicopter pilot, the BS filter of an electrical engineer, a Western medicine challenging structural integrator, and a Southern California didgeridoo player, all in the same time and in the same person. Energy and matter, sound entrainment, slave control design methods using electromagnetic spectrum, eternal life, gravity, and DMT are addressed herein. And that is Gerald Clark's introduction. And a very good one, really. It is. So let me welcome you, Gerald, and you should turn on your camera at this point so that we can bring you on the screen.
Okay, how's
there you are. Okay, say hello to everyone.
Hello to everyone. I want to wish all of Kerry's listeners a warm welcome, and thank you so much for the kind introduction.
Okay. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun tonight because you've got such a wide range of knowledge, and so I might get to pull things out of my bag of tricks as well that kind of come out of left field, but we'll see where it goes. So first of all, what I'd like you to do is tell me how you ended up as an electrical engineer and a helicopter pilot in, I guess, the war. How did you end up going in the direction of the Anunnaki?
Well, I was working in telecom, in particular in the free space optics industry, and as a VP, I was traveling a lot, and I was spending a lot of time in Turkey, which I guess was about the year 2000. Really didn't have much interest in history. I generally viewed history as the stuff that was written by the victors and everyone else got maligned. So as an engineer, I just really, I knew that history wasn't what we thought it was. But while I was over there, I wrote a patent with this guy as the telecom market was being deregulated in Turkey. And they figured they had 225 million customers that they could reach out to. So I was spending a lot of time there. Well, in that process, I got at least to the place where I decided to address my ugly American syndrome, where your culture doesn't matter, and what we're here and placate us and all that. And we were out at dinner one night, and I realized that the history that I vaguely knew of the world wasn't correct, especially the chronology. And it just so happened I was reading a book. I've said this many times. I was reading Guns, Germs, and Steel on the way over, or on the airplane to Istanbul. And in it was talking about one of the Turkish cities that was very old that used to trade obsidian. And it's east of Göbekli Tepe. It's called, west of Göbekli Tepe, called Katal Hayat. And I may not be pronouncing that right, but very important city. They had dated this city at 9,500 years old. And so all of a sudden I realized that I really did not have a good grasp of history. I kind of knew that Mesopotamia was approximately 3,800 BC, and Egypt was 3,100 BC. But beyond that, I was like, well, we don't really know much else. You know, everyone else lived in caves in Alaska and southern France by that point. So I kind of got turned on to history a little bit, and especially the symbology and some of the stories about Abram, the patriarch of the three worlds religions, were being told there in Turkey by my customers. And they had described Abram as somebody that was born in Turkey in a cave. I was like, really? That's not coincident with what I was taught as a Southern Baptist in the Bible, right? So all this kind of stuff was coming up. And, you know, I got interested, actually, and I started looking into the history just a little bit so that I could at least talk to them about their history, a lot of which we truly didn't know. And so at that point, I was dabbling around thinking I was going to write a book on ancient technology because I was an engineer, and we had somewhat of a meltdown in the telecom market in 2001, and we were all the executives were somewhat on a hiatus. Okay, so I was taking this time to catch up on all this stuff that I hadn't had a chance to read after doing this international travel, and one thing led to another, and I stumbled across von Daniken's book and Sitchin's work and all the others that were in the alternative history field that weren't really being talked about. So I read all their stuff and essentially went into corroboration mode for a very long time. So I actually started writing my first book in 2004. And I had just a pile of research, there was so much I didn't know how I could possibly consolidate it into something that was consumable by the lay public. It was very, very deeply academic stuff. A lot of the German literature and stuff that Zechariah Sitchin had gotten into. Anyway, so I finally started writing this thing, and then simultaneously I'd get stopped because I realized that most people weren't talking about this when I was writing this. This was way before the History Channel was doing the Ancient Aliens, right? So as an engineer, if I were talking about what I was doing in my hobby, looking into ancient astronaut theory and alternative religions, that's not generally somebody in electrical engineering does and stays in electrical engineering. You know what I mean? At least, especially not then. So we knew a couple of quote unquote people that had left the high-tech industry and gone off chasing UFOs and things like that. And, you know, they were pretty much lambasted within the circles of the corporate community where we worked. So I certainly didn't want to be one of those, but at the same time, I had to be true to myself. So from 2004 until 2013, when I actually released the book, I felt like I'd missed the wave. I felt like I should have published way before the History Channel came out with all that stuff, you know. But I figured also, it also, because it was so hard to accept this fantastic theory of an alternative history, that a little marketing wave might help my work. So I wasn't sure when I published the book in 2013 if I was going to have any traction at all, really. And so I actually, one of the authors, I think, got lucky because that particular topic turned out to be very popular. But a lot of authors aren't that lucky. So had I not been lucky, I wouldn't have been able to stay being an author. That's for sure.
Okay.
That's what got me into it.
So, but you brought some of your sort of scientific side. You know, wouldn't you classify yourself as more of a scientist than sort of a general knowledge kind of person? Or would you actually say you did get into the humanities in other places in your life?
I think I was strictly a science guy until about 2004. So these alternative histories I was reading, that coupled with an alternative healthcare venture I went on, partly to help myself, but partly to help my son, took me off into a very different approach as a scientist. I felt like I was the only scientist among a lot of people that were mostly right-brained. They were into somatic therapy and, you know, hands-on kind of things and mind-body stuff. It was a place I was interested in, but I was interested in it from a theory and a mathematical standpoint and a pragmatic standpoint. So through that process, I learned to be a structural integrator while I was living in Hawaii. And this turned out to be a very profound change for me in terms of getting my body more related to gravity, which I had no idea would have a subsequent change in human consciousness. I mean, what was happening to me? I should write a book completely about that. And this is a known issue that goes on in the structural integration community, that you're playing with energy and matter in a very profound way. And that really took me from being strictly a scientist to a scientist that could also see that in the esoteric space that there was clearly a connection. The scientists hadn't A, had a pragmatic experience with it so that they could try to reconcile their theories to it, or been able to come up with a theory in the first place to explain it. So I think a lot of that stuff's coming out now. Is there's a very significant merging of science with, I don't know, new age concepts that, you know, we finally caught up where it's not magic anymore. It's, you know, I'm not saying take the soul out of everything and it's all science, but there's even science that we can describe energetically of what we believe to be the human soul, and I think that's where we need to be at this conversation. So that I brought that from my electrical engineering background to this space, which I knew other people in this space had not done that. And I didn't know why. I was, you know, what my mission, what my role was. And I'm asking myself these questions while I'm working with hundreds of clients as a structural integrator, no longer doing technical work, as, you know, running a private practice in the healthcare field. So I had that perspective. But while I was doing that, I never lost my interest in the concept that I thought about when I was very young, which was, where does energy meet matter? Because that's the place where we're going to have an experience with the infinite. Whatever this perception prison is we're living in, that's where it happens, right? And this coincides with spiritual teachings that I learned later in life. That, you know, the kingdom of heaven, whatever that is for you, happens within. And so I was very focused, well, if there's energy and matter, and I'd always thought as an electrical engineer about bodies and planets and photons and neutrons and, you know, the energy particle zoo, but I had never really applied it to myself until I got involved with this alternative healthcare system, okay, the structural integration community. So in that process, go ahead.
Just let me ask you to define structural integration as you see it, and I'm guessing perhaps this also relates to your son. I'm also wondering if you're actually talking about chakras and kundalini and all of that when you're talking about structural integration or not.
I am. This is the part that doesn't get talked about in that community. And I'll give you kind of a run over it. And I know that you've had energetic experiences, and this might be very illuminating to you. And I used to teach all my clients about what was happening to them. They'd ask me, why am I feeling different? What's going on? Well, just so you know, I bought imaging equipment and had a lab. And I imaged my clients before and after energetically and with pictures to correlate their human structure that we were looking at with lines and planes and all kinds of analysis software with the gravity field, which turns out was correlated to their imaging of their energy field. So if they had, as a chiropractor term, if they had a subluxation or some twist in their spine, or there was something really off in their posture from a whiplash injury or falling as a kid, or, you know, skateboarders, whatever, that would show up structurally, and then you could see it energetically on this camera that I had. And I'm like, well, finally I get this. You know, we're kind of an antenna. So this started my thoughts about a human antenna way back then, and that led to me writing some equations from the electrical engineering space, knowing about light and wavelength and frequency stuff I dealt with all the time, and applying it to the human condition and saying, well, is this a way to measure our chakra levels? And I included the chakras in this equation. That's in both of my books, by the way. So the first book, I wrote it just deriving it symbolically like any engineer or scientist would do. In the second book, instead of describing it that way, I decided to use natural language to describe it. So I had two opportunities to reach out to people so they would understand what my views are on energy and matter and how this relates to your spiritual life. Because they're very connected. You can't distinguish them. So that was very important to me.
Okay, great. Now, in terms of doing this, are you saying that, did you begin at this time to meditate yourself and try to activate your chakras and connect them? I'm not going to look at it the way you do, obviously. Right, so I'm not going to use your kind of language, but you understand my meaning when I say connect your chakras and have samadhi experiences. Did you do any of this on your own? And did you then, through experiencing it on your own, I'm not sure how it would pertain to your son, whether you tried to get him to work in this way. I'm not sure how old he was at the time of. Oh, okay. Do you want to elaborate at all?
Yeah, let me tell that story real quick. So the founder of this work, structural integration, was a German woman who was named Ida Rolf. She was studying medicine on the East Coast. She had a child who had polio. One of the legs was mangled and couldn't walk. She was seeking a solution for him and was looking outside the box. She believes she came up with a recipe to change human connective tissue so that it would soften up and allow the bone structures to naturally align to the gravity field, which is what she found out through this pragmatic application of a recipe that she coined. Okay, she coined it the Rolf 10 series. Well, that was kind of just the beginning. Well, so I saw that she had the same problem I had. I had a child who had braces on his legs, couldn't walk, and he had connective tissue problems. So I saw that maybe what she did could help him. That's why I went to learn what I did. Okay. Well, it turns out it did help him significantly, got him out of the braces, and he was very balanced. Well, I didn't know that was going to take me into a full-time practice. So how does this connect to your chakras and your energy and all of that? Well, this has to do with gravity. And it turns out that the structural integration community is completely focused, and this is what their outside message is to relate the human structure to the gravity field. Well, then you got to start asking yourself, well, what's the gravity field and why does it matter? Well, it turns out it significantly matters, and that's what the equation I wrote shows, is that gravity is one of the controlling parameters in that equation to determine whether you're going to have a maximal experience of your Kundalini energy through your antenna. Okay, if you're not integrating gravity, you don't get all the way there, right? So it's one of the most powerful forces you experience in daily life, right? So she had a little recipe that turned on people's chakras. It would basically, if you change the connective tissue relationship to the vertebra, all of a sudden this central pole of your human spine that's a conductor can all of a sudden experience energy that it never experienced before. Right? It's like, and yoga. So through this process, I had the process done to me at least 3 times in the couple of years I was learning to do the work. And through that process, my entire structure started changing, and exactly like she said, started feeling gravity through the top of my head, and all of a sudden I couldn't slump anymore. You know, it hurt. So there's a force within each of us that's an intelligence that knows how to line up your structure with the gravity field. It's built into us, but you're not taught. You weren't taught this as a child. I wasn't taught this as a child. We get told, hey, sit up straight, right? Well, after a certain period, your connective tissue goes to sleep because it's been injured or whatever, and you can't. And this has a huge, huge impact on the human antenna. As I saw with cameras in my labs, and also from that initial process of structural integration, it causes you to naturally want to stretch. You can feel everything starting to come apart. You're like, oh, has that really been stuck like that all my life? You're kidding me. Like that, right? All over your body. And it progressively happens such that once you trigger this malleability threshold in a human, these changes can continue for years without doing anything else. Just playing the game of go, okay, where's gravity? And it keeps, like tuning in a radio station, it keeps trying to get you to align with it if you play the gravity game, okay? So that's why structural integration was really important to me. And also, I met some people in that space, probably for the first time outside of the engineering and academic community where I came from, where I could talk about the Anunnaki. And there were a few of them that were, you know, had read a wide variety of things that had a position on it. And some of them I very much respected. So it helped me get to the place where I was confident enough to publish my book, which I finally did in August of 2013.
Okay, so in terms of what your book is about, because I want to make this transition to talk about the book, because some people are not going to understand how you integrated, literally, your theory about this structural integration into a concept of how the Anunnaki affected humanity's growth and physicality, and also ends up with mind control and so on. So can you kind of go down that road?
Sure. Well, I've told the story of the Anunnaki Genesis many, many times. But in order to answer your question, I'm going to focus in on the primitive worker's perspective of how we would have been designed such that they could control us. Because you have to remember, in the Atrahasis account, one of the key documents that I used is in my first book, and everybody should read that one. If you get nothing else out of this interview, please read the Atrahasis yourself. It's not that long. And there's something magical that happens when humans put their eyes on that document. on their own, not what somebody else said or you heard about it, blah, 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 or so-and-so's wrong. Just try reading that document yourself. You'll have a profound experience. In my opinion, and my wife's opinion, she wasn't even fully on board with everything until she read that document. So it's very powerful. So from that document, we found out that the Anunnaki were here. They had a mission to get some resources from the Earth to protect their planet. And I won't go into all of those details. I want to focus on your question about what did they do to us such that they could control us. And you have to recall in that Atrahasis account, they had GG miners, these miners that they brought with them, and had ended up putting them in the mines to work in South Africa. And after a very long time, it turned out to be a Shar in the first tablet of the Atrahasis. They revolted. And long story short, the Anunnaki who had a presence there had a council meeting to decide what to do about that. And this council meeting probably was very important in establishing what the constraints were for the replacement workers in terms of how would you control them so we don't have this happen again, right? This is the government's basic problem right now, is how do you keep the people at bay so they don't rise up and they're out in the streets, you know. Whoops. Oh, you brought something else up. Okay. So so I wanted to focus on how did the Anunnaki, how did they design us such that that could be achieved? So this is where the electromagnetic spectrum comes in. Can you hear me okay, by the way? It looks like you just end up with an Atrahasis document.
Yeah,
oh, okay.
I actually was just showing people the definition.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were going to do that. I thought maybe I lost the connection. Anyway,
no, we're all here. We can show pictures while you talk. So don't even, sorry about that if it was unexpected. Yeah, no worries.
So I did something kind of unique in my Anunnaki Nibiru book. Yes, I told the history, gave you some evidence, biological, astrological, documentary, all of that. And everybody's been doing that because it's such a controversial thing, right? It's a controversial, it rewrites the entire history of mankind. So I did that, but I also went to the place and said, okay, if they made us, why did they choose meat over tools? Why did they, what could they have done with us through the electromagnetic spectrum when they crafted us such that they could control us, right? And this, my electrical engineering background, this is the part that kept jumping up at me. I'm like, well, what about entrainment? What about the reticular activating system? These primitive organs that are in our brain that clearly could be susceptible to any kind of electromagnetic spectrum, especially if it falls within the brainwave region. And then your chakras as well. Each one of those is a different wavelength and frequency. So there's a susceptibility there. And so I kind of looked at that and integrated what I knew about mass and gravity and weight and the speed of light and wavelength and frequency and all the relationships, and I put an equation together to go from, well, if we look like this, could they have created a frequency that would affect us in the way that they wanted so that we would be under their thumb, under their control? Now that's everything from receiving commands to in broadcast, like in a broadcast format, to get everybody to do a particular task, or even to detect the intent of one of the workers to not follow orders and lead to a rebellion, just like we have with Minority Report, right? Pre-crime. I mean, they totally. So all of a sudden, I backed up and I said, "Wait a second. If they could transmit to us, then we're a receiver. And if they could detect our intent, that means we have to be a transmitter in some way." So I started going into the reality of that. Is the human brain produces electrical, signals that could be measured, and depending on the sensitivity of the equipment you have, they could do everything that we're talking about: read brain waves, see the electrical development of the chakras, know what the awareness level is, completely from a satellite or a low Earth orbit satellite, or even initially it probably started with our 3-letter agency community from across the building, right, where they're putting some high gain antenna and reading it, looking at you. Now as far as I'm concerned, you're a brain wave with some modulated data on it that they can detect from space. Okay, if it was our government who had it, okay, you got to think higher than that. We're talking about beings that were way more advanced than the technology we have right now. So they were probably able to telepathically go and read everyone's intent without them being able to do it back. You know, you have to think a little more along the lines of what these advanced space travelers probably were capable of to understand genetically the clamps. Now, so there's bad news in our constraints, in our design, so that we would be enslaved. But the good news is you start peeking into our DNA, noticing that there are prodigies across the world who seem to have somehow overcome their alien clamp, and they're doing phenomenal things, whether it's mentally or telepresence or telekinesis or whatever, or remote viewing. Humans have this capability, and it's sneaking out through various genetic anomalies, and it's showing up. So you have to ask yourself, was it always there? Has it been clamped? And now we believe that the DNA has clearly been clamped. We called 95% of it junk, which is not true. You know, people like William Brown have been looking at the different link polymers where the splicing took place, and so did Lloyd Pye as well, knowing that there wasn't an evolution, there was an intervention. Okay, so let's get back to the energetic part. So knowing that, the good news for me was discovering that there appeared to be latent circuits designed in humans, both in the DNA and in your sensitivity externally to energy. Think of the nine Mayan underworld frequencies where they were describing it. Well, if they all fell into the brainwave frequencies of a human, maybe those are 9 different perception experiences you can have if your brain waves on one of those frequencies, right? So you can kind of think about that and then go, well, what would change the external frequency? Either going toward the diameter of the interior of the Earth, or possibly going through the galactic center, which we know is energetically very different than the area outside of it. And this was where I started noticing the connection between the human antenna, the electromagnetic spectrum, and our, I don't know, wobble cycles of our solar system through the galactic center that happens every great year, every 26,000 years approximately. And it just so happens we're entering that. So I'm like, wow, are our antennas going to be getting lit up by these latent circuits that were left for us so that we start progressively waking up? I think so.
Well, let me ask you about Adam's calendar. Have you gone out there and met Michael Tellinger and been to the stone circles where the...
I haven't. No, I actually found out about Adam's calendar very early on, before he ever even wrote his book. And I was so excited because I knew he'd been following Zecharia Sitchin's work. And not so much just Sitchin's work, but even in the Hot Trahasis, it talks about mining down in the Abzu, okay, in Enki's territory, that when they drew lots. So I think he did a great service to the Sumerian story by going to Africa and at least finding some structures there to connect that. But we already knew about the gold mines down there that were, you know, hundreds of thousands of years old. So.
Well, but what the interesting thing, and it's too bad you haven't gone down there, because what you can find out is also the use of sound, the fact that the kinds of stones they constructed the circles with ring like bells, as Michael would say. Mm-hmm. And I've done a documentary with Michael down in South Africa. I've been down there, I think 3 or 4 times now. And I'm an earth sensitive, and I'm able to feel energies and vortexes, etc. And I can tell you that the energies are very strong and powerful. And this is another thing that would affect the so-called, you know, Adamu or gold mining beings that they were trying to mind control, because gold, first of all, you're in the presence of a lot of gold in this place, and gold is a conductor, and also can also transfigure. Well, it's actually can create a portal into the other dimensions. But aside from that, it's also used in space travel, as the secret space program knows very well. And on top of it, it can. So you're talking about people, you know, not only being brain, you know, washed or brain or mind control, but they're in an environment where this can be actually augmented or escalated.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. Well, it sounds like you're excuse me, interested in how they possibly use gold monoatomically.
Well, it's not just monotomically. I mean, you're talking about a mineral in the ground in the area, you know, a concentration. So you're talking about a very rich area where it's actually you know, in the actual electromagnetic environment in which they
Right.
exist.
Well, I've been to places like that, places that have a high energy, like Sedona, and there were places in Hawaii that were just off the matrix.
Yeah.
So to answer your earlier question, I did start doing yoga and meditating quite a bit, and it came naturally because of what was happening with my body. So, my relationship to energy is pretty wild sometimes. I've taken it as far as I can go, and I think there's still a lot farther to go, but it's been one of those things that made me probably different as an engineer, is I was having a very profound pragmatic experience doing martial arts and yoga and Tai Chi all at the same time, and it continues to this day. It's an amazing process. It's the best trip on this planet, as far as I'm concerned, is getting yourself back aligned with gravity, because you'll have that energetic experience where all these things come. Like, is that the only way? No. It's a great way to keep yourself out of pain, to be extremely flexible and not bound up, because your fascia holds all that stuff and you're not aware of it and you can't control it. So without intervention, you can't change it. And you can change a lot of yourself, but you really do need intervention, because there's an awareness that what's got you by the back of the neck is what you don't know that you don't know, and you can't do anything about that.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what you're saying with that when you say that without intervention. I
mean by getting some, and I'll just give it out right now for people that are interested in this topic. Take it for what it's worth on the surface, but underneath there's a lot more. It's probably the best money you'll ever spend on your body. It's Rolf Guild, ROLFGUILD.org. And they're pretty much in every 50 state. It's an international gig, so they have a big presence in lots of different countries. But interview a few and find out what it's worth, and I'll tell you what, you can take it from me. You won't spend better money on your human antenna. So.
Okay. Well, acupuncture also works very well as there's all kinds of hands-on treatments that various Chinese practitioners use to affect the body. But moving along that line, so you did these, you kind of, I think one of the things that you brought to your book that was a little more unique than most, we're talking about these subjects, is that you really brought in the idea that mind control started a long time ago, that, that humans have been mind controlled since the beginning. And that, in fact, maybe that's part of our, at least our interactions with the Anunnaki and the intervention of the Anunnaki on the human genome. Now, I understand that you may not know or even be interested in all the various other races that have been influenced and impacted our genome up to now, but I can say that certainly the Anunnaki is a very, very important point in our history, and so this is key information. The other thing you did is you are kind of a cross correlator, a synthesizer of information. So what I'd like you to do is also talk about like how your synthesis, your conclusions that you reach, because some of your conclusions I agree with, and some of them I'm not so sure about. And, this is a topic that needs a lot of investigation. It's still an open subject. But Agreed. Can you talk about some of the conclusions that you had that went against the grain, so to speak?
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, I started noticing from the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish and all these documents, there's a set of players, okay? And there are key players, and then there's some more minor players. So some of the key players turned out to really challenge my belief systems, my religious belief systems as I was growing up. And, you don't even realize how strong they still are until they're challenged in this way, in this particular way for me. Okay. And I've always been a truth seeker, and I've always been open to synthesizing information from any source. And so that said, probably the most controversial thing for me in the very beginning was finding out that Allah is referenced in the Atrahasis as leading the rebellion of these workers on behalf of the Anunnaki. And I asked myself, in my first book, could that Allah be the same one who's the Allah behind the religion of Islam? So I start synthesizing all these different names into relationships and countries as well. So that was the first one. And then come to find out that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is from the city of Ur, where he was headquartered, and sent Abram out via Haran to take over the Levant with the promise that they were going to be given this land of milk and honey, right, in the Bible, right? So that was the other one for me, is when I started digging into the city of Ur, which turns out to be a very important pre-diluvial city for the Anunnaki. There was Nippur and Ur and Uruk and Bad Tabira and Sharupak and all these major cities, and some of them have been found with researchers, and Eridu, can't leave Eridu out. So I found out in the city of Ur that Abram's father, and I actually went and got a book on Abraham just to study this from various religious standpoints and doctoral standpoints. When I found out that Abram's father was serving the deity in the city of Ur, I was like, wait a second, that's the city where Enlil is. How can that be? Right? So all of a sudden I found out that Enlil was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he had lots of other names, whether it was El Shaddai or Yahweh or Jehovah. They were all the same name, okay? My head almost spun off when I realized that. Do you realize the impact of finding out who that being is? He's the one who shows up in the Old Testament that they call God in Genesis 1:18. Let us create man in our image and our likeness. It's him.
Well,
He was the head of the Anunnaki Council when they called that meeting.
Yeah,
right?
And I have to say, though, that there will be people that disagree with you. So,
well, they can disagree. It's down in museums. Disagree with the museums for putting it in there, right?
Yes, and just before we kind of get away from this area, though, this is where the taking over of Iraq by the U.S. was very, very important, as you may know, and the whole significance of Saddam Hussein and who he thought he was Nebuchadnezzar reincarnated, and the fact that he was opening the portals to the Anunnaki, which maybe some people aren't aware of, and also the art. The beautiful pieces of art that then some of which were stolen, some of which were destroyed, etc. So this is the city of Ur, and this area we're talking about.
Well, it was Ur, and it was all the way up to Mosul, where their museum was raided, and we started out with Sir Henry Laird in the city of Nineveh, and then started working down the Tigris and Euphrates until we started finding it got older and older as we went into Sumer. So that was number two. So I found out Allah was one of the rabble rousers and a fellow god with the Ajiji. That's what came out of the tablet, one of the Altraces. Then I fast forward, found out that Enlil, who was the head of the council, his dad was back on Nibiru. If you read, they drew lots, and Enlil was rank 50, Lord of the Earth. Okay, so there he was in Mesopotamia, just like he drew on lots to have that place. So he knew he was supposed to be there. Everything that happened in Mesopotamia after they drew lots was under his rule. So that was number two for me. And then to come to find out that what happened on Abram's watch to overtake the Levant area, and it was a genocide. Listen, this wasn't land that was unoccupied. This was genocide. Then I realized, wait, this being who calls himself God in the Old Testament, Enlil, dispatched Abram to do that. And that to me was like, okay, who is this being? And he shows up in the Atrahasis as the one bringing the disease, cutting off the food, and ordering the flood. Okay, so I'm like, wait a second, this is the great deceiver, the great MF and destroyer, and he's being venerated as the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the three world's religions. And all of a sudden, I realized that I was in deep water here because, first of all, the biggest deception, in my opinion, in the history of mankind has taken place by the great destroyer portraying himself as the creator of all. And the reality is, when you dig into the Anunnaki records, the creator of all was someone they venerated that was not even part of this dimension. So all of a sudden, you realize one of the Anunnaki came here. He had a mission to get resources. He imposed himself as God and started laying out the law for, okay, you Jewish people, you got to follow the law or I'm going to kill you. And he was the God of wrath and vengeance for them, and he still is. Why would you have a fear of your creator? Think about that. Okay, that was number one. Okay, And then you see Nanar Sin, the crescent moon god, showing up as the god of Islam. And now, if you go to the second dynasty of Ur, that same city, in the Lamentations of Ur that I put in my second book, Enlil and his father, Anu, met on a council and decided to nuke that city with all the inhabitants inside. Is that your God? I'm going to lay it down right now. Is that your God, people that are going after me? I'm telling you what, if that's it, going along with him and see what happens.
Okay, well, let me throw something out here that you might, I don't know if you've looked at it like this, but my understanding of the way the Anunnaki operated is that they knew damn well they weren't God, but that they decided to deceive the humans into believing they were gods and God. Per se, God was one. But even in the Bible, the word God, I think it's Elohim or whatever it is, actually means plural gods.
That's
now,
right.
Interestingly enough, on a psychological basis, what they were really doing was deceiving the humans into putting all of their spirituality into their rulers, which are the Anunnaki, and
That's
believing
right.
they are the embodiment of the creator, in the big word sense.
That's
that way.
Right. That's right.
So it's actually not only the Jews that were deceived in this way, but it was all the different religions, especially in the people that wrote the Bible. Yeah. And so when they use the word God in the Bible, this is a problem. And it's a mix. In other words, it's a mixture. Sometimes they're talking about, you might say, creator with a big C, and sometimes they're talking about creator with a small c, and they really mean an Anunnaki.
Right.
So
let me just clear that part up. Enki was a geneticist. He never claimed to be the god of the creation of all. Only his brother did, that was not even involved in the process. Okay, so keep that in mind.
Right.
Number two, yes. he venerated the creator of all. He knew that, what they did was expeditious to have biological meat hosts doing their bidding. Well, listen, they brought the Ajiji. They were doing it before. So it wasn't like something new for them to have people working on their behalf. Now, whether they viewed it as slavery or not, I don't know. Okay. But they revolted. So they sure didn't like what they were being asked to do.
You mean the heat?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was, so now what I've laid out is we found out Allah was one of Enlil's kids. He's his son, by the way. Nanar Sin, as Allah, is Enlil's son. He was the king of the city of Ur when it was nuked. He was the rabble rouser that led the Ajiji up against Enlil's house in the Atrahasis. Okay, there's a good reason for that. Okay, so now we found out that he's claiming in Genesis to be the creator, made man in our image and our likeness. Well, that was a council decision in the Anunnaki records, where they said that, exactly that.
Okay, now, I mean, let me also go back to your sources. Let's sort of, because what you're doing, again, you're a synthesizer, and you're gathering information from things like the Nag Hammadi scrolls that were, some of these things and the Book of Enoch were hidden, actually. So they weren't even.
I'm telling you right now,
possible.
It's coming only from the Atrahasis. I'm just sticking with the Atrahasis for a reason, because I'm so tired of people going, well, he didn't translate it right. Listen, what I'm telling you is on stone in the British Museum. Okay, I'm not making this up. I'm not synthesizing anything here. I'm conveying what's on those tablets to you right now.
All right. So
but I am a good synthesizer, and I do that as well. Okay. But I usually do that at a correlation level learning before I ever bring it to the public.
Okay, hold on. So just because, I want my audience to understand, and, we have a small audience here. It's not that small, but, but actually when it goes on YouTube, there'll be thousands, if not millions, that will see this. So I want to make sure that we're clear. So the Atrahasis, if you can again explain, because if you say you're referring to the Atrahasis, and I had the definition on the screen just earlier.
Right.
But can you explain, why are you using that as your, in a sense, your definitive text?
Well, for number one, it was a document that was held by the University of Oxford and was translated by their academic team. Had nothing to do with Sitchin. listen, I love Sitchin, but I could not bring him in and use him as references while everybody's putting daggers in his back, okay? So I went to the highest academic source from Stephanie Dolly, who was a researcher in the field, actually touching these tablets, okay? And I believed, and I've looked at the digital archives, I believe their translations were as good as any on this planet. That's why I started with it. Not because I didn't believe the Lost Book of Enki or the Book of Enoch or any of that other, but I significantly reference those 11 tablets in there because why? It names all the main players, who did what to whom, and how we ended up in this situation. If you just read those, okay? Who did the genetic modification? Who was actually had their hands on? We didn't talk about Enki, who was the geneticist that actually did the in vitro fertilization into his half sister, Nin Hartzog, who was the medical officer in the city of Sharupak, where Noah was the king. Now I'm synthesizing, okay? But Noah had several names. He was called Atrahasis. He was called Ziusudra. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he was called Utnapishtim. That's why Gilgamesh left on his epic, was to go find him, to find out how he could get eternal life like he got. That's what the whole story was about.
Okay, excellent. Now, you've also put together, I assume you've read the Book of Enoch as well, right?
Right.
And so as I recall your book, and you know, I may be wrong here, but you didn't seem to bring in a lot from that. You didn't bring in a lot about what are, you know, referred to constantly as the Watchers.
Right. Well, okay.
Tell me about your perspective on that.
Well, they clearly, the Ajiji were, in my opinion, the Watchers. Okay. Because if 200 of them. What do you think they're composed of?
What do you think they're made of?
I think they look very much like the Anunnaki. As a matter of fact, I think they're just a subclass of the Anunnaki. As a matter of fact, in the Atrahasis, they call them fellow gods. These are not like shackled.
The Nephilim. Are you calling the Ajiji the same thing as the Nephilim?
Well, the Ajiji, I believe, were the Watchers. The Nephilim were the offspring of the Watchers with the humans, and the Elohim were the high-ranking Anunnaki that were on the council, generally speaking. Does that?
Okay.
Okay. So
yes, and can you describe the Elohim or Anunnaki? You're actually saying the Anunnaki are which I've often thought was the case, although a lot of people don't want to believe that. But the Anunnaki and the Elohim, describe them physically.
Well, I don't have to go very hard to do that because they left statues and images of themselves all over the planet. So they look like the archetype of male and female generally.
Right.
They seem to be taller than humans by a couple of feet in some cases more. They're generally white-skinned, blue-eyed, which I found very interesting because this came from the book.
And the men had beards. The men had beards, yes.
Yeah, they generally had beards.
All over the things, the structure, you know, the carvings in Iran, for example.
Oh yeah, the Cliffs of Behistun is one of my favorites. That shows Enki and his winged disc over the 3 different languages, describing how Darius I had put down all these uprisings with Enki's help. He was another name for Enki, and you have to get used to this with the Anunnaki. They lived a very long time. They were in dang near every culture. If you dig into it, and you'll find out who their gods were. It was the Anunnaki or their offspring. So the fact that their name would show up in one culture and then be called another name in another culture, to us, you know, that's like impossible. But to them, they did it all the time. So let's just do a couple. We started sneaking up on Allah. We snuck up on Enlil, who called himself God. Enki was our creator. Actually, he was a geneticist, but he doesn't call us God. He calls our creator of all God, right? So now we got 2 creators that we don't either one understand. Then there's Isis, Nin Hartzog, who was actually Enki's half-sister and the medical officer. She's very important to this story. Shows up in the Egyptian story about Isis, Osiris, and Horus. So these beings, when you look at a god table and compare them in what culture their name was, as you progress forward from Sumer all the way through Greece and then Rome, and then you can go forward in time more, you realize that these main players, let's just do the 3 big ones. We had Enlil, who was then known as Yahweh in the Bible, who became Zeus in Greece, who became Satan, according to John in the New Testament, when he talked about his city at Pergamum. The seat of Satan was in Pergamum. Well, the Temple of Zeus was in Pergamum, right? It's at the East Berlin Museum. You can go see it today. Okay, so all of a sudden, we start seeing these names going across from Mesopotamia over into Greece and Rome. And by the day, it was called Jupiter in Rome. Okay, so then we can take Enki and do the same thing. Ea in the Enuma Elish was his name. He shows up as Enki, which means Lord of the Earth, when he first got here about 450,000 years ago. Enlil means Lord of the Air. Enlil became Enki, or Enki, Ea became Enki, which became Poseidon in Greece, and he was also known as Neptune in Rome. Well, that was his planet, chosen out of the Enuma Elish. They each had planetary affiliations. Enlil had chosen Jupiter, Enki had chosen Neptune. Ninshida, who was known as Thoth the Atlantean and Thoth in Egypt, was Enki's son, and he was a geneticist as well.
Well,
and he's where all the controversy comes in. He's where all the controversy comes in. Okay.
Yes.
He was the one that was setting up.
So I want to ask you. I want to ask you about Marduk.
Okay.
Because you may know the cult and all about the return of Marduk and all of that. Have you followed any of that?
I do. Well, Marduk was Enki's firstborn son of him and his wife Damkina. I'm sorry, his half sister. So he was actually in line to rule. Marduk was. Yeah. Whereas his next son, Ninshida, had a different set of constraints because his wife was, or his mother was a Reshignol. We can talk about these family lines got crossed over. Yeah, the Enlilites and the Enkyites, they sometimes crossed over to try and bring peace. Marduk, at the time that the lots were cast and his father got Africa, had no business being in the Levantine or in Mesopotamia, which was Enlil's area. He decided to stay there and set up the city of Babylon, which he believed was a place where he built 12 apartments essentially for the other gods on the council to come and be there, because he was trying to build a bond heaven earth there, which was what the Tower of Babel was, so that he could launch craft back and forth to Nibiru, through way stations on Mars, whatever it was, bypassing Enlil's command authority all over the Sinai and Mesopotamia where he was in charge. So all of a sudden you got one of Enlil's kids, or half-brother's kids, who's in your territory, who's basically threatening your command, right? So Marduk ended up causing significant wars between the Enlilites and the Enkyites, and this actually involved the General Abram as they fought over the territory near Haran. So that was actually part of Marduk's forces, the kings of the east that were fighting with him. So when you look into the Bible, you'll see that. So eventually Marduk, about 2000 BCE, according to records, made it all the way to the highest rank of the Anunnaki Council on Earth, which was rank 50. And in commemoration of that, the 50 names of Marduk were read every spring in Babylon, and along with the Enuma Elish, their epic of creation, showing how our solar system came into being. So it looked like Marduk was playing avenger to his father, according to some of the writings that we saw in the past, by staying in Mesopotamia, in the region that belonged to Enlil. But it's not really clear, because he seems to have had a falling out with his father's wishes, who was Enki. And if I had to guess right now, based on what I'm seeing with the arches of Baal, by the way, if you look at what happened in Palmyra with ISIS destroying those arches, these arches were dedicated to the god Bel. And Baal was another name for Bel Marduk. Okay, so if you look in how the proximity of Palmyra, Syria to Babylon, they're pretty close. And Marduk had influence in that area. So he was trying to take over the entire region and take it away from Enlil. And it looks like he did it for a short period of time, and we don't know exactly what arrangement happened between Enlil, who had the position of 50, and Marduk, Enki's son, that got it. Because there were just constant wars, and one of Anu's grandchildren, Inanna, who was known as Hathor in Egypt, was very much involved in those wars, in the pyramid wars in Egypt. So the Enkyites down in Egypt, the Enlilites up in Mesopotamia after they drew lots, and there was nothing but conflict, and it's always been that way. I actually looked at these guys and thought, you know what? you guys are advanced beings from another planet and do all this crazy stuff. Why can't you get along? You know? And then you start asking the question about, were they all fallen angels like the right-wing Christians would have you believe? Not all of them were. Some, I mean, their personalities, and I've said this I don't know how many times, seem to have ranged from serial killer to saint, just like we have today. And so they weren't just like us. Well, we're just like them.
Absolutely. Well, these are our forefathers, so to speak. So if you look at also in Egypt, you can see, and this also goes on in Iran, and I'm sure in Iraq. You'll always see a little human on the lap of an Anunnaki, this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So there, I mean, there's so much symbolism on the walls carved in the Middle East, and a lot of it never makes it here, which is really quite fascinating.
Right. I wanted to tell you, I just recently got the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and I was reading through it and looking at all the wonderful pictures. And I think it's in its umpteenth republication edition. It's been around for a long time. Yes. But one of the things that kept coming up is,
there's a ton of symbolism around Kundalini activation in these things that people don't recognize. So now at this point, and you've actually done sort of a really tour de force in terms of covering a lot of history very quickly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if you can talk now about where you think this is going, because, and I am curious, what kind of academic, backlash have you experienced since 2013 when you published your book?
Well, it's been a very isolating experience. Let me just say that without naming any names or anything. But at the same time, you find an online community of all the people and the seekers that are turning over the rocks and seeking the truth, and they become your new community. So, as far as I've had a few people reach out. There were a few people in my space that I had shown genealogy tables to and discussed that I was writing a book, but very few. These were people outside the company that were technical, that were coming in as service providers, if you will, that were on the same story. And so there's a few of those, but not that many. And ever since I went public, though, I've had lots more from all over the world that, connect with me, engineers, scientists, lots of different, all walks of life.